Okay, so let me move this just right. Okay, continuing on the review, the first 12 questions from the review study guide. Question number 1, what is I? Square root of -1, that's the only acceptable answer. What is I squared? -1, that's the only acceptable answer that we have for that one. Okay, that is not like the question, that is the question right off the test. Number 2, solve the square roots. X squared equals 100. Square root each side, like it says, these cancel. Make sure when you put a square root, you put a plus or minus symbol. So plus or minus the square root of 100, which is 10, because 10 times 10 is 100, and -10 times -10 is 100. So plus or minus 10. Number 3, y plus 3 squared equals 25. Again, it says to solve the square roots. So square root each side. Square root here, these cancel. Y plus 3 equals, again, make sure you put the plus or minus symbol. Square root of 25 is 5, so plus or minus 5. I would write it as this, y plus 3 equals 5, or y plus 3 equals -5. Then solve each of those. Subtract 3 to each side, you get y equals 5 minus 3, which is 2. Subtract 3 to each side, you get y equals -5 minus 3, which is -8. So the answers are 2 as well as -8. 2 or -8. And you get question number 4. Solve by factoring. N squared minus 5n equals 0. It equals 0. It's supposed to. When you factor, it has to equal 0. There's a common factor of n. Factor out an n. N times n is n squared minus n times 5 is 5n. What makes that turn into 0? 5. 5 minus 5 is 0. What makes n 0? 0 makes n 0. So the answers are 0 and 5. Solve by factoring. X squared minus 9x equals -20. It's got to equal 0. This one doesn't equal 0. The last one did, this one doesn't. So make it equal 0 by adding 20 to each side. So you have x squared minus 9x plus 20 equals 0. There is no common factor here other than 1. So we draw our two sets of parentheses to factor. Our first term is x squared, so x times x. We look over our middle term and look at our last term. It's a positive 20. How do you multiply and make a positive? Either two positives or two negatives. We got to get some negatives somehow, so it's got to be two negatives. How do you times 20 but add to 9? 4 and 5. So what makes this turn into 0? 4 does. What makes this turn into 0? 5. So the answers are 4 as well as 5. Question number 6. Says 8 minus 3i minus -2 minus 5. Okay, this first set of parentheses you really don't need, so I'm just going to write it as 8 minus 3i. Distribute the negative sign though. When you distribute a negative sign, everything turns opposite. So that -2 turns into a +2. The minus 5i turns into a plus 5i. Add the real parts. The real parts are 8 and 2, which is 10. Add the imaginary parts, -3i and positive 5i is a positive 2i. So 10 plus 2i. Number 7. Simplify 5 plus 3i times 2 minus 7i. Okay, we're going to FOIL here. Our first terms, 5 times 2 is 10. My outers are 5 times -7, that's -35i. My inners are 2 times 3i, that's 6i. Whoops, 6i. And my last terms, 3i times -7i. A positive times a negative is a negative. 3 times 7 is 21. I times I is I squared. Don't forget the square. Put together your imaginary parts, 6i and -35i, that's -29i. With a 10 out front, minus 21, I squared is -1. So replace that I squared with -1. So we have -21 times -1, that's a positive 21. And then we put together 10 and 21 and get 31, minus 29i. 31, take away 29i. Okay? Okay, 5 more questions. Some of this here. Question number 8. Simplify 5 minus 2i squared. When you square something, that means you times it by itself. So 5 minus 2i times 5 minus 2i. If you FOIL that out, your first terms are 5 times 5 is 25. My outers are 5 times -2i, that's a -10i. My inners are also 5 times -2i, which is another -10i. And your last is negative 2i times negative 2i, and negative times negative is a positive. 2 times 2 is 4. I times I is I squared. Put together negative 10 and negative 10, that's a negative 20i. With a 25 out front. I squared is negative 1. So we have 4 times negative 1, which is a negative 4. We can put together 25 and negative 4 and get 21 minus 20i. So 21 minus 20i. Question number 9. Solve x squared minus 3 equals negative 8. Okay. Add 3 to each side. We're going to solve this with square roots because there's only one x. Negative 8 and 5, or 3 is negative 5. We square root. Make sure you put the plus or minus symbol. These cancel. So plus or minus, pull the negative out. If there's a negative inside of a radical, it's imaginary. So I radical 5, and that doesn't simplify. So plus or minus, I radical 5. 3 more. Number 10. Okay, x squared minus 8x. Okay, they want to know what makes c into a square. You look at this number right there, negative 8. You do 2 things to it. Divided by 2, you get negative 4, and you square it. Negative 4 times negative 4 is positive 16. That's all you got to do. If this happened to be a 20, you'd cut it in half and get 10. Square that, you get 100. Number 11. Solve by completing a square. X squared plus 6x plus 3 equals 0. Okay. It equals 0. That's normally a good thing when we're factoring or using the quadratic formula, but we're not doing either one. We're completing the square. If you complete the square, you have to have your x's on one side. Anything without an x, like a 3, get rid of. So subtract 3 to each side. Then complete the square. Take this 6, just like we did up here. Cut it in half, 3, square it, and get 9. So we're going to add 9 here, and we're going to add 9 here. This is a square now. So write something squared. You always put x here, and you always put half this number. Half of plus 6 is plus 3. Put together 9 and negative 3 and get 6. Now it looks like question number 3. Square root each side. These cancel, so you have x plus 3. Don't forget your plus or minus symbol. Square root of 6 does not simplify, so plus or minus the square root of 6. And to get x by itself, last thing you have to do is subtract 3 to each side. So x equals negative 3 plus or minus the square root of 6. Okay, one more. Find the vertex. Okay, so we have 12y equals x squared minus 8x plus 3. X squared minus 8x plus 3. Okay, I'm going to write it like this. X squared minus 8x, leave a space, and then put a plus 3. So we're going to put a number there. We're going to do the same thing we did the last 2 questions. Take this number, negative 8, divide by 2, you get negative 4, and square it, you get 16. We're going to add 16 here. You learned a long time ago, if I add 16 to the right, I have to add 16 to the left. What else you could do is you could add 16 to the right, you could also subtract 16 to the right. So I'm going to put a plus 16 and a minus 16 both on the right-hand side. This is a square. So put something squared, you always put x, you always put half that number. Half of minus 8 is minus 4. 3 and negative 16 is negative 13. Your vertex is opposite, same. The opposite of negative 4 is 4. The same number is negative 13. Vertex is 4, negative 13. Okay? All right, that's the rest of the review.